other musicians because you tend to, it's like a painting you want to make straight or whatever. You just hear it, music like you hear it. Doesn't mean that,
Prince didn't hold back when it came to protecting his music. He had zero patience for bands that copied, watered down, or threatened his vision. Over his career, at least 6 major acts caught his sharpest criticism, whether in words, actions, or silent judgment. Let's jump straight in and see who agitated the Purple One's feathers, why, and what came of it. Did he really dislike them that much? Across decades, Prince demanded brilliance, originality, and risk from himself and others. These 6 bands, in various ways, challenged his ideals, but in doing so, they also highlight the uncompromising genius that made Prince unforgettable. Band 1, Maroon 5. From the start of his career, Prince was intensely protective of his musical originality and control. He believed art should come from the instinct of the creator, not from formula or mimicry. So when he publicly criticized the band Maroon 5 for their cover of his song Kiss, his issue was less personal vendetta and more ideological, a defense of his creative integrity. According to reports, Prince took issue when Maroon 5 included a cover version of his track Kiss on the deluxe edition of their album Overexposed. Prince's view was blunt. Why do we need to hear another cover of a song someone else did? Art is about building a new foundation, not just laying something on top of what's already there. That comment reveals the root of his friction with Maroon 5. It wasn't simply that someone covered his work. He would allow covers under the right circumstances. But that, in his eyes, this was symptomatic of a broader erosion of originality. In a music world that he felt increasingly prioritized marketability over invention, a band of Maroon 5's mainstream position seemingly epitomized what he found frustrating. At the time, Maroon 5 were chart-dominant pop rock, selling big, playing arenas, and operating comfortably within the commercial machine. Prince rose via the fringes, working his way from Minneapolis, shaping his own path, mixing funk, rock, soul, pop in unexpected ways. When he saw a major mainstream act repurposing one of his signature tracks, he likely felt a symbolic challenge, someone else trading on his legacy rather than forging a new one. The cover may have seemed innocuous to many, but to him it represented a co-option of the past rather than the creation of the future. To understand the context, in his later years especially, Prince's wariness of the industry's emphasis on derivative formulas became more pronounced. He publicly bristled at the idea of acts being manufactured or shaped by label machinery, of songs being churned out for mass appeal. As the article summarized, he seems to have held originality, artistic integrity, and creative exploration in high regard, always choosing to push his own sound in a new direction and scorning those who failed to live up to his standards. With Maroon 5, the friction is then captured by a moment. The band takes a song like Kiss, revisits it, packages it for their audience. For Prince, the idea of a mainstream, commercially successful band doing that felt emblematic of a loss of respect for the craft. His creative process had always involved writing, producing, performing, being intimately involved at every stage. When someone else picks up his work and repackages it for broader consumption, he may have seen that as a breach of his artistic covenant. There's another layer, Prince's own attitude to covers. While he did allow them under the right terms, he was highly selective. He expected respect for the original work, for its roots in his authorship. He didn't want his songs diluted or used as mere stepping stones for someone else's career. To him, a cover isn't simply a version of a song. It's a continuation of a story. If that story gets reduced to a commercial plug, the originator, him, sees the inevitable artistship compromised. Maroon 5's trajectory and decision may have triggered exactly that alarm. In addition, Prince had always operated with a DIY ethos, writing his own songs, playing multiple instruments, producing, arranging. He was accustomed to being more than just the singer, so when he observed other acts succeeding in a structure that didn't mirror that hands-on authenticity, he felt some friction. With Maroon 5, whose model was partially centered on contemporary pop production and mainstream appeal, Prince may have felt they embodied what he opposed: popular success without the deeper creative immersion he valued. What followed the dispute? Publicly, the friction didn't explode into full-scale conflict. Prince didn't wage a war against Maroon 5. Rather, it served as a marker. He was signaling what he didn't tolerate. It wasn't about personal animosity so much as principle. And for his fans, it sent a message. Prince, though generous in collaboration, drew a firm line when it came to how his art was treated in the broader musical ecosystem. Prince's frustration with perceived shortcuts, the recycling of ideas, and the dilution of the creator's role. With Maroon 5, the cover of Kiss was an obvious flashpoint. It was a high-visibility act from a mass-market band, and that made the issue sharper for Prince. He wasn't merely upset at a cover. He felt the cover was symptomatic of a system that he had spent his life fighting. What about the next group that rubbed him the wrong way? Band 2, The Time. The story between Prince and The Time is one of the more complicated and revealing episodes in his career. On one hand, The Time emerged from his orbit. Members assembled and groomed in the Minneapolis funk scene that Prince helped cultivate. On the other hand, their very success and independence became a point of friction, revealing Prince's deep concerns about control, legacy, and recognition. The Time were formed in the early 80s, with Prince writing songs and producing for them while still performing his own material. They provided the soundtrack to elements of the Minneapolis sound that he championed. Yet, over time, the relationship shifted. The Time grew in popularity in their own right, and that growth led to tensions. According to interviews, Prince was uneasy with the idea that a band he helped create might eclipse him, or at least gain an identity separate from his own. One fan comment put it bluntly, "The Time were made up in his head." He was so controlling, he even created his rivals. A clear manifestation of the friction came when leaders of The Time, most notably Morris Day, accused the Prince estate, and implicitly Prince during his lifetime, of blocking use of the band name. Morris Day claimed, "I've given 40 years of my life building up a name and legacy that Prince and I came up with. I literally put my blood, sweat, and tears into bringing value to that name." The estate denied that the band was being blocked, but the dispute underlines the underlying issues of ownership and the blurring of Prince's personal brand with the band's identity. Prince's discomfort also traced back to his early role as musical architect. He wrote and produced songs for The Time, sometimes acting as a ghost contributor, thereby strengthening his control over their sound and direction. But as The Time matured, they increasingly stood on their own. For an artist like Prince, who prided himself on being the auteur of his work, the rising independence of a band he founded may have felt less like a proud achievement and more like a potential threat. Add to that the fact that The Time's live performances, visual identity, and charisma were tailored for mainstream fun and funk, areas Prince entered but didn't always dominate. In essence, The Time began to occupy a space that mirrored Prince's early ambition: flashy, tight funk, attention-grabbing. In some markets, according to Reddit comments, Prince would reportedly not let us perform when we were touring together because he didn't want that kind of pressure. This anecdote illustrates how sensitive Prince became about an act he helped incubate, drawing too much light away. There's also the personal dimension. Some of the original members of The Time were people Prince recruited, mentored, or collaborated with. Alexander O'Neal, for example, said he got fired by Prince early on. The dynamic was not purely professional, it was emotional, creative, familial, and sometimes fraught. Prince had high expectations, and when collaborators or protégés started building their own names, he seemed to diverge from cheering them on and moved into a more wary stance. Despite the tension, The Time undeniably benefited from Prince's genius. They charted hits, their live shows were acclaimed, their brand was tight and polished. But for Prince, the success of The Time posed a mirror. What he saw in them was a reflection of what he did, and, potentially, a challenge to his status as singular creator. If The Time could do what he did, perhaps better or more fun, what then was his edge? The thought, whether conscious or subconscious, appears to have weighed on him. One of the broader patterns we see in this equation is Prince's ambivalence toward the bands he helped create. He loved innovation, but he feared dilution of authorship. The Time signaled both innovation and potential dilution. Prince wasn't simply upset with a band's behavior, he was addressing fundamental questions about musical ownership, legacy, and originality. He wanted creative ownership not just of songs, but of the entire ecosystem around him. The time, in gaining autonomy, unsettled that ecosystem. Time passed. Prince disbanded or distilled his own backing bands, shifted focus, changed monikers. The time continued. Long after Prince's peak commercial years, the legacy of the time still raises questions about the relationship between master and protege, founder and offshoot. The 2022 estate dispute over the use of the name reminded everyone that the tension never fully dissipated, even from beyond his lifetime. From the outside, some might see the dynamic as jealousy or hypersensitivity. But for Prince, it likely boiled down to this. He built a musical world with his hands and demanded it remain aligned with his vision. When a band he built started to make that world variably theirs, he recoiled. The Time were not simply another band. They were an extension of his musical mission. And when that extension seemed to have a life of its own, he found it uncomfortable. What about the next group whose rising success seemed to stir his ire? Band 3, Vanity 6. Vanity 6 occupies a unique spot in Prince's story. A band he created, produced, and in many ways controlled, yet one that also became a source of tension and eventual estrangement. Unlike Maroon 5, where the conflict was about covers, or The Time, where it was about independence, Vanity 6 illustrates how Prince's issues sometimes arose from personal, creative, and image-driven concerns. Vanity 6 was formed in 1982 at Prince's direction, designed as a provocative female trio to embody a bold, sexual, and unapologetically assertive persona. Their hit, Nasty Girl, perfectly captured the aesthetic Prince envisioned: playful, edgy, and unabashedly confident. But the story behind Vanity 6 was never just about chart performance. It was also about control and ego. Prince handpicked the members, wrote most of the music, produced the tracks, and even influenced their public image. In essence, Vanity 6 was a project in which he exerted total creative authority. The tension began with the group's lead singer, Denise Matthews, known as Vanity. While Prince had originally seen her as the ideal embodiment of the band's concept, Vanity's growing independence created friction. According to interviews, she became increasingly assertive about her role, her image, and the direction of the music. Prince, who was accustomed to having full control over his creative projects, reportedly felt challenged by her confidence. The situation was compounded by Vanity's personal life, including romantic involvement with Prince at one point, which added emotional complexity to the professional relationship. Prince's response was decisive. He reportedly expressed frustration over Vanity's attempts to exercise authority, ultimately leading to her departure from the band in 1983. Vanity was replaced by other members, but the chemistry and the original spark never fully returned. This incident exemplifies Prince's exacting standards and his intolerance for creative dissent, especially in projects he initiated and nurtured personally. To Prince, art was inseparable from his vision, and any deviation, even by someone he had chosen and mentored, was a threat to that vision. Beyond Vanity herself, Prince's discomfort extended to the way the media and fans perceived the group. Vanity 6 was packaged as a provocative, sexually charged act, often emphasizing image over musicianship. Prince, who prided himself on musical innovation, reportedly bristled at this focus, feeling that it undermined the artistry behind the project. He was highly protective of the balance between style and substance, and when the public narrative skewed too far toward image, he saw it as a misrepresentation of his work. Moreover, Vanity 6 highlighted Prince's broader struggles with gender dynamics in music. He created and controlled female acts while insisting on his own creative supremacy. This dynamic often created tension because it left little room for autonomy. Vanity's eventual decision to pursue a solo career further fueled the sense that Prince's protégés were stepping out of his shadow. While he supported talent in principle, he struggled when that support translated into independence that might challenge his authority or alter the narrative of the acts he had built. Musically, Vanity 6 also represents a point of friction over artistic direction. Prince had specific ideas about the sound and presentation of his projects. When band members wanted to explore slightly different musical avenues or assert personal preferences, he reportedly expressed irritation. While this could be framed as a typical producer-artist negotiation, In Prince's case, it often tilted toward conflict because he demanded near-total alignment with his creative vision. The result was a pattern that would repeat with other protégés and bands over the years. Initial collaboration, followed by tension when the protégés sought more control. Vanity Six's legacy, however, cannot be reduced solely to conflict. The band achieved commercial success and cultural impact, introducing bold themes of sexuality and female empowerment into mainstream pop and funk. Yet, for Prince, the band remained a cautionary tale. Even acts he created and controlled could become sources of frustration if the members asserted themselves or if the public perception deviated from his intent. The hate, in this case, is less about personal animosity and more about his perfectionism and obsession with artistic control. Vanity Six illustrates the recurring theme of Prince's career, a drive to protect the integrity of his projects and maintain absolute creative authority. While he nurtured talent and created platforms for others to shine, he expected alignment with his vision. Deviations, even by those closest to him, often sparked tension. Vanity Six's story sits at the intersection of artistry, ego, and personal dynamics, offering a clear example of why Prince could be perceived as difficult or even combative with bands he was intimately involved with. But the tension didn't stop there. He also took aim at a group whose commercial success and mainstream influence he found hard to tolerate. Band 4, The Rolling Stones. Prince's issues with the Rolling Stones were never personal in the sense of direct confrontation or feuds, but rather rooted in his perception of musical integrity and originality. The Stones, legendary and commercially massive, represented a type of rock dominance that clashed with Prince's fiercely independent ethos. While he admired their technical skill and historical significance, he was critical of what he saw as their reliance on a tried-and-true formula and their status as an institution, rather than innovators. During the 80s and 90s, Prince occasionally commented on established rock acts, and the Rolling Stones were among those he viewed with a mix of respect and disdain. In interviews, he suggested that some major bands were recycling themselves and trading on history rather than creating new art. While Prince never explicitly attacked the Stones, his words reveal a philosophical friction, the tension between commercial success and constant reinvention. For Prince, the Rolling Stones' enduring formula and reliance on past glories symbolized the kind of stagnation he could not abide. Prince's objection wasn't about their musicianship. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the rest of the band were undoubtedly skilled and influential, and Prince respected their talent. Rather, his concern was about approach. Prince thrived on evolution, taking risks, blending genres, and reinventing his persona continuously. He viewed the Stones' adherence to familiar styles as emblematic of a larger problem in the music industry, an overemphasis on longevity and branding at the expense of bold creative leaps. This perspective also connected to Prince's broader critiques of the mainstream music business. He frequently railed against formulaic pop and rock, acts that became safe bets for labels, and the industry's tendency to reward repetition over innovation. The Rolling Stones, as one of the biggest bands in the world with decades of hits, exemplified this structure. While their fans celebrated consistency, Prince interpreted it as a lack of willingness to risk new artistic territory. Interestingly, Prince's friction with the Rolling Stones also had a competitive edge. He was acutely aware of his place in music history and the hierarchy of influence. The Stones were a benchmark for success in rock, a standard against which he inevitably measured his own achievements. Their massive tours, commercial clout, and media saturation were things he respected, but also critiqued. Prince was always looking to maintain an edge, to carve out originality that would set him apart from established giants. In this sense, his tension with the Stones was partly about protecting his own unique position. There were also aesthetic factors. Prince's music incorporated funk, R&B, pop, and rock in a way that defied categorization. The Rolling Stones were firmly rock-oriented with blues roots. Prince occasionally expressed a subtle disdain for rock orthodoxy when it became too rigid or self-referential. To him, the Stones' status as rock royalty may have come with a level of untouchable reverence that he found frustrating. He admired creativity and virtuosity, but he disliked untouchable icons who relied primarily on legacy rather than continuous invention. Despite these critiques, Prince occasionally demonstrated appreciation for the Stones in practice. He covered some of their songs in live performances and drew inspiration from their showmanship and stage energy. This duality, respect mingled with criticism, reflects a recurring pattern in Prince's assessments of artists. He could admire talent while disapproving of methods or industry approaches. In other words, his hate was complex, blending philosophical, aesthetic, and competitive strands rather than personal animosity. The Rolling Stones episode underscores Prince's insistence on pushing boundaries. While other acts might rest on past glories, he insisted on challenging himself and his audience with new sounds, daring performances, and constant reinvention. The Stones represented the antithesis of that relentless forward motion, a group that had mastered the formula and thrived on it. Prince's critique was as much about principle as it was about music. He respected talent, but he demanded courage, originality, and evolution. Any band that appeared to coalesce into a self-satisfied, formulaic institution risked drawing his disapproval. For Prince, art was alive, dynamic, and unpredictable. The Rolling Stones' legacy, for all its brilliance, symbolized a type of musical stasis that he could not fully embrace. Next, we turn to a case that was more about artistic principle than personal beef, a band that tested Prince's patience in a very different way. Band 5, Sheila E. and her solo projects. Prince's relationship with Sheila E. was one of mentorship, collaboration, and intense creative synergy, but also tension and, at times, friction that placed her on this list. Unlike some bands where the conflict was more philosophical or competitive, his issues with Sheila E. stemmed from a mix of creative control, personal dynamics, and his exacting standards. While he championed her talent, he was often highly critical of her choices when they diverged from his vision. Sheila Escovedo, professionally known as Sheila E., became closely associated with Prince in the early 80s. She was a percussion prodigy and vocalist, and her dynamic stage presence complemented Prince's aesthetic. He produced her debut album, The Glamorous Life, 1984, co-wrote many tracks, and oversaw arrangements, essentially shepherding her rise. Prince had a keen eye for talent and used his creative genius to shape her sound and public image. However, Prince's protective, sometimes controlling tendencies became evident when Sheila E. started asserting more independence in her solo work. Prince reportedly grew frustrated when she experimented with her own ideas that didn't fully align with the style or thematic direction he envisioned. While he had encouraged her originality, he simultaneously expected deference to his artistic judgment. This contradiction often created tension between mentorship and control, admiration and critique. One source of friction involved performance and recording decisions. Prince's influence over Sheila E.'s live shows and studio work was substantial, and he had a clear vision for how percussion, vocal arrangements, and presentation should interact. When Sheila E. experimented with new sounds or took her performances in unexpected directions, Prince sometimes expressed irritation, perceiving the deviation as undermining the careful balance he had cultivated. These tensions illustrate a broader pattern in Prince's relationships with protégés. He wanted them to shine, but only in ways that conformed to his own artistic framework. Additionally, there were personal factors. The professional closeness between Prince and Sheila E. often blurred boundaries, with mutual admiration sometimes tipping into possessiveness or intense scrutiny. Interviews and retrospectives suggest that Prince could be particularly sensitive to the media's focus on Sheila E., fearing that external recognition might overshadow his role in her success. This dynamic added layers to their creative friction. It was not just about music, but about perception, legacy, and the ownership of artistic identity. Despite these tensions, Prince's collaboration with Sheila E. produced iconic work. Tracks like The Glamorous Life and A Love Bizarre showcased both artists' strengths, blending pop, funk, and rock in a way that was distinctly Minneapolis. Yet the very success that made these songs timeless also accentuated the tension. Prince's desire for control meant that when Sheila E.'s solo career began branching out, it occasionally rubbed him the wrong way. He valued creativity, but demanded that it remain tethered to his vision, making independent endeavors a delicate balancing act. Another source of conflict was image and public narrative. Sheila E's persona as a strong, independent female performer sometimes diverged from the playful, stylized roles Prince had envisioned for his protégés. While he celebrated boldness, he was also invested in the coherence of his artistic ecosystem. Any deviation, whether in music, image, or career trajectory, was perceived as a challenge to that coherence, even when there was no intention to provoke. In the end, the friction between Prince and Sheila E was emblematic of a recurring theme in his career: the tension between mentorship and autonomy, collaboration and control. He could foster brilliance in others, but he struggled with the moments when their individuality eclipsed or diverged from his guiding influence. While hate may be too strong a word, his critical stance toward her independent choices reflects his exacting standards and obsession with creative purity. Sheila E and her solo projects exemplify the paradox of Prince's mentorship. He sought to nurture talent, yet he simultaneously set strict boundaries on the expression of that talent. Their collaboration produced unforgettable music, but it also highlighted Prince's complex personality, where admiration, protection, and critique coexisted uneasily. Finally, one more band that Prince clearly couldn't tolerate. Here's why. Band 6. Earth, Wind, and Fire. Prince's complex relationship with Earth, Wind, and Fire, EWF, represents another facet of his artistic friction, this time with a group that was already legendary before he emerged. Unlike Maroon 5 or Vanity 6, where conflicts were about covers or creative control, Prince's issue with EWF was philosophical and stylistic. He respected their musicianship, but bristled at what he perceived as complacency in the very sound he admired. Earth, Wind, and Fire had already achieved massive commercial success by the late 70s and early 80s. Their fusion of funk, R&B, soul, and jazz, combined with elaborate stage shows, made them icons. Prince openly admired aspects of their talent: the tight horn sections, infectious grooves, and intricate arrangements. Yet admiration coexisted with critique. He felt that the band leaned too heavily on past formulas, recycling familiar riffs and patterns instead of constantly reinventing their sound. For Prince, stagnation, even in a world-class act, was unacceptable. In interviews and informal commentary, Prince occasionally referred to EWF as excellent musicians, but they play it safe. This statement captures the essence of his tension. Prince was a perpetual innovator, constantly evolving his sound, persona, and presentation. Bands like Earth, Wind, and Fire, while brilliant, represented the opposite: mastery of a signature style that could remain unchanged and still succeed commercially. For Prince, success without risk challenged the ideals he valued most. Another layer of friction lay in performance philosophy. Prince was a perfectionist who demanded precise execution, but he also thrived on spontaneity, improvisation, and genre blending. EWF's live performances, while technically flawless, often adhered closely to rehearsed choreography and set lists. Prince, who relished the thrill of improvisation and the unpredictability of live music, reportedly found this rigidity uninspiring. In his view, music should feel alive, daring, and ever-changing. Sticking rigidly to formulas, even brilliant ones, was antithetical to the kind of artistry he championed. Stylistically, Prince and EWF occupied overlapping territories in funk and R&B, but their approaches diverged sharply. Prince infused rock, pop, psychedelic, and electronic elements into his funk foundations, while EWF maintained a smoother, polished sound designed for wide appeal. This contrast may have fueled Prince's subtle critiques. He believed that pushing boundaries, challenging audiences, and creating unexpected musical experiences were essential to artistic integrity. Bands that prioritized polish over experimentation risked drawing his ire, regardless of their success or skill. It's important to note that Prince's tension with Earth, Wind, and Fire was not rooted in personal animosity. He never publicly attacked them or attempted to interfere in their careers. Instead, his criticism was about principle: the need for musicians to innovate, to take risks, and to honor the creative process over formulaic repetition. Prince's dislike often reflected his high standards, exacting expectations, and commitment to originality rather than personal grudges. Despite this philosophical tension, Prince drew inspiration from EWF throughout his career. Their use of horn arrangements, rhythm complexity, and fusion of multiple genres influenced his approach to band composition, orchestration, and production. In a way, his critiques and admiration existed in tandem. He challenged them in his mind, yet their musicianship fueled his own evolution. This duality reflects Prince's broader worldview, in which critique and inspiration are intertwined, and admiration is never blind. By examining these 6 bands, Maroon 5, The Time, Vanity 6, The Rolling Stones, Sheila E., and Earth, Wind and Fire, a consistent theme emerges. Prince demanded originality, fearless creativity, and respect for artistic integrity. He tolerated no shortcuts, no over-reliance on past glories, and no dilution of the creative vision. While he collaborated with, mentored, and celebrated many artists, those who deviated from these principles sometimes drew his critical eye. Don't miss out on more deep dives into music legends. Hit subscribe and stay tuned for the next story. Thanks for watching.